Greetings, everyone. I'm sharing the talk that I plan to give on January 14th for the University of Arizona on narrative and neuroscience. And my talk is about the human need for stories. Stories are how human beings organize our experience. They're our instruction manuals for how to live life in the world. They're how we store our memories. Stories are everything for human beings. And as Leslie Marmos Silko said, who is the author of the bestseller novel Ceremony, stories are all we have. They're all that stand between us and sickness and death. If you don't have stories, you don't have anything. So there's a developing area of philosophy, narrative philosophy, which says that everything about humans is organized in the form of stories. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to have a little bit of neuroscience, enough to whet your appetite, I hope. And if you want more, there's an article that I wrote in the Journal of the Anthropology of Consciousness called Narrative and Neuroscience that will take it further. It's a simple Google, Scholar Google, to find. So I start with this picture because it reminds me of a television program from my youth that began, there are 6 million stories in the city. And I thought that was profound because within any given person, there's thousands of stories. So even as each human being is a story, within each human being, there are thousands of stories. So think about the incredible number of stories that circulate in a city like New York. So, as usual, I have nothing to disclose, and I acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land, the Tohono O'odham and the Yaqui peoples, and their elders, past, present, and future. I'm reminded that there are 8 million stories in the naked city. So a couple people who are important in this movement are Jerome Bruner and a fellow named Turner. And they were really the ones who really put forth the idea that human experience is organized in a narrative format. And so getting down to what doctors do, which is important, we do story. We make up stories to convince people to do what we tell them. And we believe our stories, and that's why people believe us, because they can feel our commitment and belief in our story. And if you want a message to be received, you work it into a story. So people have stories about how they got sick. Arthur Kleinman famously called this the illness narrative. And people have stories about how they think they can get well. And he called that the healing narrative. And one of the things that Kleinman, who was a medical anthropologist, figured out is that if the doctor's story about how to get well is too far apart from the patient's story, nothing will happen. The patient will reject the story. And we call that, of course, non-compliance or non-adherence. And so, what is a narrative? What is a story? So, a story has at least 2 points in time. So, it has a linear structure in the sense that event A happens that appears to lead to event B. And the process by which A leads to B is called the plot. And typically, a narrative has at least one character who travels from A to B in accordance with the plot. The shortest story that I ever heard was told to me by one of my clients. She said, once upon a time, I killed my boyfriend, but then he woke up and tried to kill me. That was when we were living in Florida and selling cocaine. Well, so there's 2 events. It's intriguing because if she killed him, how did he wake up and try to kill her? So it has suspense. It has 2 characters, she and her boyfriend, and it has a context, which is the time when they were living in Florida and dealing cocaine. So it's actually quite a rich story. And I'll bet it makes you curious. You probably want to hear more. So it's a good story because it leads us to want more story. And doctors tell stories. And stories are what convince people to do what we want them to do. And there's some really interesting research about this. There's a researcher at Stanford University named Crum, C-R-U-M, who's studying stories as placebo, which is really fascinating. And what she's figured out is that a good story actually changes physiology. It actually impacts disease processes. And for example, in one of her studies, she collected housekeepers from hotels around Palo Alto and randomized them into 2 groups. So in one group, she told them a story that all the work that they were doing all day long met the recommendations of the Surgeon General for exercise and burned so many calories that they would inevitably get into better shape and lose weight and lower their blood pressure. For the other group, she told the opposite story, that they weren't getting enough exercise, that they could develop things like high blood pressure, that they could gain weight. And both stories were told in a very convincing way. And lo and behold, the groups changed in the direction of the stories that they were told. The first group decreased their blood pressure, lost weight, were in better condition, cardiovascular condition, which was the opposite of the second group. So the only thing that changed was the story that they heard. And so we want to tell inspiring stories that lead people to believe that they can get better. And one of my colleagues, Anne-Marie Chasson, told me a story a couple days ago about one of her clients. And she told the client who had scleroderma that this woman could get better, that the scleroderma symptoms could go away. And she related to me that the woman told her that no one had ever said that to her before. And lo and behold, the symptoms went away. They got better and they went away including her pulmonary fibrosis. And so telling stories is perhaps more effective. Telling good stories is perhaps more effective than medication. It certainly has less side effects. Of course, if you tell negative stories, then it does have side effects. And that's what I think we need to learn, that our dire predictions and our naysaying to people that they'll never get better actually harms people. That we can do harm through the stories that we tell. We can do good, we can do harm. Stories work in both directions. So shortly, I'm going to tell you about the part of the brain that manages stories. But I want to emphasize that healers of all cultures are telling stories all day long to inspire their clients to healing. And I want to tell you a story from Maine, where I come from. And it's a Wabanaki story. Wabanaki means people of the dawn. And those are the indigenous people with whom I work. And it's a story about Rabbit. Because once upon a time, Rabbit had a long, beautiful tail. And once upon a time, Rabbit's legs were of equal length. And once upon a time, Rabbit had a totally normal-looking nose, like any dog or cat or anyone else that you might encounter. And Rabbit was altruistic. Rabbit loved to help others. Rabbit was always running through the forest, helping those in need, being just a very good guy. And once upon a time, Rabbit heard some shrieking and hollering and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And Rabbit ran over to see what was going on. And it turned out to be Fisher Cat. And Rabbit said, "Fisher Cat, what's wrong?" And Fisher Cat said, "I'm lost, Rabbit. I'm trying to get to my wedding. And I'm lost. And if I don't get there in time, Crow will marry my bride." "Oh, no, we can't have that," said Rabbit. "I wouldn't want anyone to marry Crow." Tell me about this place. What does it look like? And Fisher Cat said, "Well, it's almost an island." And Fisher Cat went on to describe other aspects of the location. And a light bulb went off, of course, it would have been a fire burned in his brain, Rabbit's brain, because there weren't light bulbs yet. Rabbit said, "I know exactly where we need to go. And follow me." So off they went running. Oh, it was so hard for Fisher Cat to keep up with Rabbit, because Rabbit was one of the fastest runners in the forest. Rabbit routinely outran Fox, who was also a fast runner. And sadly, Fisher Cat was looking so hard at Rabbit running that he wasn't paying attention to the ground beneath his feet, and he fell into a deep hole. And again, he started wailing and hollering and crying out, and Rabbit heard him and came back to see what had happened. And Rabbit found him in a hole. And Rabbit said, "How'd you get into that hole?" "Well, obviously, I fell into the hole." So Rabbit said, "Well, can't you climb out?" "No, because I put on some extra pounds with all this wedding feasting. And the walls are quite steep." So Rabbit said, "Well, let me lower my tail, and you can climb up my tail." Well, so that's exactly what they tried to do. But when Fisher Cat was almost at the top of the hole, Rabbit's tail broke off. Oh my, and down he went, plump. down to the bottom of the hole, holding Rabbit's tail. Well, that was traumatic, but Rabbit didn't pause to think about it. He just said, well, here, let me lower my hind legs and you can climb up on my hind legs. And that's exactly what Fisher Cat did. But in doing so, he stretched out Rabbit's hind legs so that they were much longer than his forelegs. But Fisher Cat got out of the hole. And Rabbit took a look at himself and said, oh my, oh no, oh my, oh no, and things like that. And so Rabbit had to learn how to run again, because you can't run with hind legs so much longer than your forelegs. You have to hop. And so he figured it out. He figured out how to hop. And off they went. And slowly but surely he got the hang of hopping. And they arrived at the wedding in the nick of time to prevent Crow from marrying Fisher Cat's bride. Well, now they had a wonderful wedding feast, and Rabbit was so enthusiastic, but a little bit clumsy due to his new leg configuration, that he stepped on the dress of Fisher Cat's bride and tore it. And it hurt her feelings deeply. And Rabbit was so sorry. And Rabbit said, oh, here, let me sew it for you. And carefully he got out his bone needles and his sinew, and he sewed that dress. And he held it so close so that it was perfect that he accidentally sewed his nose into the dress. And when he pulled it out, his nose broke open and he had a hair lip. Oh no, but still nothing could detract from the wedding. And when it was finally over, Rabbit was making his way home, and he came upon a pool of water upon which the moon shone brightly. And he looked at his reflection in the water and he began to cry. His beautiful tail was gone. His legs were totally different. He had a hair lip. And Glooskap heard his crying. Glooskap is the cultural hero of Maine. And Glooskap came over because he really loved Rabbit. And he came over and he looked at Rabbit and he said, Rabbit, maybe this is for the best, because that tail of yours was always getting caught up in the briar patch, and you were always getting almost eaten by fox because of that bushy tail of yours. Now you can run fast through the forest without worrying about your tail getting caught on anything. And hopping, just think how much easier it is to hop over obstacles than to run around them or over them. Why, hopping may be just what you needed to get that edge, that you need in the forest. And look at your lips. They're just perfect for eating clover, which is your favorite food. So really, your misfortune is actually a benefit to you. And Rabbit thought about this and said, oh my, oh yes, perhaps you're right. Perhaps what I thought was trauma, was horrible, was terrible, is actually a blessing in disguise. I think I'll think about that. I think I'll take your word for it. And happily he hopped off into the distance. And so that's an example of a story that takes adversity and turns it into opportunity. And it's a class of stories I love to tell to people. And it's how people learn to change their perspectives, is through hearing stories in which characters change their perspectives. And so stories have important elements. They have meaning, they associate things, they use imagery, they have metaphor, they have plot, characters have motivation, personality. And I think what's really key for us as physicians is metaphors. because a metaphor is what allows you to take something from one place to another place. And if you've been in the Athens airport in Greece, you know that the luggage chariots are called metaphora, because they're what you use to take your luggage from one place to another place. And here we use metaphors to take sometimes our physical discomforts into an emotional language. Because as we'll talk about, the anterior cingulate gyrus, which accumulates sensation, can't tell the difference between physical and emotional pain. And it delivers both with equal valence to the frontal cortex for processing. So I just wanted to read you one of my favorite metaphors, just to give you a sense of the power of metaphor. And this is from a novel written by a friend of my wife, whose name is Helen Humphreys. So here's how it goes. The wild dogs roam the summer fields just outside of town. Their eyes flash, bright stars in the woods at night, and they weave like fire through the dry grass towards the edge of the city, looking for something to kill and eat. Love is like those wild dogs. If it hunts you down, it will not let you go. And what you can never know from the beginning is how hard or how long you'll love something. How even when it is gone, the love you felt will still chase you down, loping like dark flame through your blood. The wild dogs are real. They are out there, beyond the safety of the streets and houses, beyond the lights of the city. And one of those wild dogs is mine. And isn't that powerful? Doesn't that say more about love than you could ever say in an academic discourse? It's what makes stories so powerful, is that they hold so much more information than an academic manuscript. So I want to tell you a little bit about one of my studies about stories. So when I was precepting for a family medicine residency program, the residents would come into the room where the preceptors sat, and sometimes they would roll their eyes about the next patient they were going to see or had just seen. And these people were the last people that they wanted to see. And I had this idea that if they knew more about the lives of the people at whom they were rolling their eyes and castigating, that they might be more compassionate, that we might change the culture of the preceptor room. And so we had some medical students, and we trained the medical students to do a life story interview with people. And they did. And these were all people with chronic pain. And typically those are among the patients that doctors don't want to see, because we're, of course, so poor at dealing with pain. And people are angry about that, and we fight about opiates and things like that. And so the medical students got their life stories. And before the life stories, we gave the doctors and the patients a life story interview. I'm sorry, a doctor-patient relationship questionnaire to complete. And the patients also got the McGill short form pain inventory and the Zoom anxiety inventory and a depression inventory. And we repeated these measures every 3 months for a year. We transcribed the life story, put it in the chart for the doctors to read. And amazingly, every doctor read the life story. We had 126 people in the study. And at the end of the year, the doctor-patient relationship quality had significantly improved, more so on the part of the doctors than for the patients, but significant for both groups. The pain inventory, the pain levels on the Miguel inventory had dropped significantly, more so than with many medications. And the depression and anxiety levels had not changed. But that's another story that we could talk about at another time. But the important thing was pain diminished and relationship quality improved. And of course, I believe the two are linked. So I'm going to give you a little bit of neuroscience now. And it turns out that in the 1970s, when fMRI was coming online, people were doing studies of all kinds of things, because you could publish a paper on almost anything in those days. So adding numbers could be a paper, subtracting numbers could be a paper, multiplying numbers could be a paper. And you needed a baseline condition. And so the researchers told people to just not do anything. Now, imagine not doing anything. That's hard to imagine. And there was a scientist who looked at the people not doing anything and said, there's an incredible similarity when the people don't do anything, but left it at that. And it wasn't until 2001 that Rakel at Washington University in St. Louis figured out that this default mode, when people don't do anything, is actually something. And what they're doing when they're not doing anything is making up stories about the important people in their lives, because that's what people do when their brain is on idle. And so what had been called default mode network was actually story brain, social brain, and story brain, narrative brain. So it's a midline network of structures that perform story, help us to create and understand story. And the bottom row of brains is your brain on story. And the top row of brains is your brain performing a task that requires executive functioning. So there's an executive functioning network in the brain, and there's a story brain. So they turn one another off. When executive function comes online, story brain goes offline. And you can see this in our residents when they come into the hospital in the morning. They turn on their task mode and they forget all about their outside lives, whether they're getting along with their spouse or not, whether they're in financial difficulty or not. They're hyper-focused on potassiums and sodiums and calciums and BUNs and all those things. But at the end of the day, they turn that off and they go back to story brain. And as they drive home, they're probably thinking about the argument they had that morning with their spouse, or the discussion they had with their parents about finances or some other social situation. So the narrative circuitry involves these midline brain structures, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate gyrus, the posterior cingulate gyrus, the precuneus, the orbitofrontal cortex, the ventral temporal pole, the ventral medial nucleus of the striatum, the fusiform gyrus, the medial temporal lobe, the dorsal temporal pole, all of these amazing networks, all of these amazing brain structures are part of the narrative circuitry of story brain, including our friend the amygdala, which we'll come back to in a little bit. So, as I said, story brain is social brain. And one of the classic studies that's so important is the study that demonstrated speaker-listener neural coupling. So when I tell you a story and you listen to a story, the same parts of your brain and my brain light up or are activated at the same time. So this is an explanation, a potential explanation of empathy, because I'm experiencing in my brain what you're experiencing in your brain when I listen to the story that you tell me. And the way this was studied was by putting people telling stories in fMRIs and putting people hearing their stories in fMRIs and comparing the results. So more parts of story brain. And so I want to just mention some of the parts and what they do. So some of the subsystems are the medial temporal lobe, and it's involved with memory. It's connected to the hippocampus, and the medial prefrontal cortex does theory of mind, and that's when I think about what you're thinking about, that's theory of mind. So I think that you're thinking like I'm thinking, and I'm trying to figure out what you're thinking. The posterior cingulate cortex integrates sensory memories, and its neighbor, the precuneus, gathers sensory information. And then we have parts of the parietal cortex that do visual processing, motor planning, recall autobiographical memory, and think about what other people are thinking. And then we have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is where we think about who we are and we think about who other people are. So, so these parts of the brain, this default mode, helps us to identify information that's emotionally relevant to us, and helps us to retrieve related information so that we can build complex stories about what matters in our world. And of course, the posterior cingulate has some other functions. It makes sure we can jump up and run from a tiger if one shows up while we're doing that. So posterior cingulate cortex also has some other functions. It mediates the experience of imagining yourself as a fictional character. And this is a technique that we find really useful, is being able to feel what it's like to be in another character's shoes, in another character's circumstance, and to imagine other people's desires and beliefs. So all of these parts are heavily interconnected to develop a good story. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about how mindset and narrative and placebo are related. So mindset means what it is that we expect. Narrative teaches us what to expect. And when we expect something, it often happens. And this is really one of the great mysteries, I think, of neuroscience, is how it is that our expectations and beliefs are translated into physiological changes, like the patient I mentioned of Anne Marie's. And I have some other stories to tell you. So a really interesting short story was told to me by a French osteopath. And he was supervising an osteopathic clinic for Ukrainian refugees. So he's teaching at an osteopathic medical school in Lyon. And a woman has elbow pain. And the trainee who's treating her helps her for less than a day, and then the pain comes right back. And the student asks my friend, whose name is Ron Ellis, if he'll treat her. And so Ron, having an interest in narrative, said to her, which the student hadn't thought to do, he said, "Tell me about the time when the pain first appeared." And she said, "Well, do you remember that missile that hit that maternity hospital in the Ukraine?" And he said, "Oh, yes, it was on all the news." She said, "Well, my apartment was across the street from that hospital. And I was out on my balcony smoking a cigarette. And I saw the missile falling from the sky. And I watched it hit the hospital. And the force, the concussive force, blew me back into my apartment. And I landed on my elbow. And it's hurt ever since." And so Ron treated her osteopathically while talking about the trauma of her experience of watching the destruction of that hospital. And after that, she improved, and the pain went away. So the osteopathic treatment required the recognition of the story that went with the pain in order for it to be helpful. Now, I also know that Ron is the kind of person who believes that everyone can get well, as I do. And I have a story, my own story, from one of my clients about this. So I had a client walk into my office once upon a time and announced that she'd been hospitalized psychiatrically more than 300 times and had attempted suicide at least 75 times. And she'd been to everyone in the town and around the town in the region. And she'd been on every combination of medications you could imagine. And she challenged me to fix her. And I said to her, "I don't know how to fix you. I mean, you've been to people who are brighter and more knowledgeable than me. And you know more about medication than I'll ever know because you've taken all of them. So why don't you just tell me your story and let's see where we get to." So that took about 10 hours, not consecutively, I might add, but spread over time. And one of the things that I learned from her story was that she was half Native American, half Lakota. Her mother had an affair with a Lakota guy and had gotten pregnant and had given her daughter to her parents to raise. And her parents hated Indians. And they treated my patient terribly, and they gave her siblings full permission to abuse her, which they proceeded to do. In in terrible ways. It was a miracle that she survived childhood. And once I had that story, I thought, well, let's celebrate her Native American part in a way that her family never did. So I proceeded to tell her stories, and mostly Lakota stories, and also stories of agency, stories in which the character was living in adversity or encountered adversity and took action to change his or her situation, condition. So finding agency. And, we went like that for a year or two. I told her stories. I did some acupuncture. I did some osteopathy, things like that. Now, I think she forgot to be hospitalized during that time. She certainly forgot to attempt suicide. And one of the things I discovered was that she'd been cutting herself at the site of acupuncture points. So one of the things that I did that I thought was kind of cool was that I gave her some needles to take home to stick into those points and turn instead of cutting herself. And it actually worked amazingly better. So at some point, after a year or two, she began going to the groups that we offered. And we had fragile minds, complicated minds, and pain group. And she said, well, I have all those things, so I'll go to all the groups. And in fragile minds, you could just sit and paint. In complicated minds, people sometimes competed over who was the craziest. And of course, pain is pain. So she started going to all the groups. And then she eventually said to me one day, I'm bored with being crazy. I don't want to do it anymore. I want to be healthy. So she announced that she was going to start exercising, eating well, and doing all the things that I asked her to do that she'd never done. And so she proceeded to do that. And she got healthy. She got off all medications. She became able to work. She started producing art and selling art. And she's living well. And years later, still living well. And no further hospitalizations or suicide attempts. And she was interviewed later by a filmmaker about so how did she, what was it, how did she get better? And what she said was that what mattered was that I never lost the vision of her as being well, that I always held that vision and was certain that she could become well, and kept telling her stories about people who had gotten well and animals and other characters who had overcome adversity. And I just wouldn't be convinced that she was hopeless. And so I think that it really matters to the brains and the bodies of our clients that we believe that they can get well, and then we tell them stories that reinforce that. And so I have a couple of other stories that I want to share with you. because we need stories to inspire us, to tell inspiring stories to our clients. And so once upon a time, we had a client who she believed that she didn't deserve heat or food because relatives of hers had been in the Holocaust and had been in concentration camps and had gone hungry and cold. And she felt like the only way to honor their memory was to also go hungry and cold. Well, the problem with that plan was that her landlord didn't want the pipes to freeze. And you probably don't have that problem in Tucson, but we definitely have that problem in Maine. If you don't keep your house warm enough in the winter, your pipes freeze, and then terrible things happen. So the landlord really wanted to keep the house sufficiently warm for the water to flow. And so we were talking about this story, and in my office I had mini puppets. And puppets are great characters for using to tell stories. And I asked her to pick a puppet who was telling the deprivation story, and she picked the Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I said to her, at least one of your ancestors would think that you should be warm and well fed as a kind of success for their suffering, that they suffered in order for their descendants to have a better life. And she said, yeah, well, maybe one of them. And I said, well, pick a puppet, that would tell that story. And so she picked a tiny little rabbit. And it's kind of a mismatch when a tiny little rabbit goes up against a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So I said, I think I need to loan you a character to battle T-Rex. And I wonder if you could look at the wall and pick a puppet that you could take home to assist you with this fight. And so she grabbed hold of Panda, a panda bear. And this was during the time when Kung Fu Panda movies were very popular. And she said, I'll take Panda because Kung Fu Panda fights evil, but he would never go up against a Tyrannosaurus Rex without eating his noodles first. And he likes to be comfortable. He likes to be warm. So I said, well, you take that panda home and sit him beside the thermostat. And every time you're tempted to turn it down, he's going to tell you to turn it up. And maybe he'll also remind you to eat your noodles or whatever else is in your refrigerator that might be interesting. And so she did that. And we continued to work on this story that her ancestors had suffered so that she could have a good life and not a suffering life. And slowly and surely over time, she incorporated that story and was able to eat and keep her house warm and return the Kung Fu Panda puppet to me. And so telling good stories, telling inspiring stories makes a difference. And just a couple other studies that I wanted to mention before we run out of time. There was a study in South Carolina about people telling stories about how they lowered their blood pressure. And just listening to this story resulted in reduction in systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure over time. And similarly, people writing stories about difficult life experiences resulted in improvement in asthma and rheumatoid arthritis 4 months later. And so telling stories makes a difference. And I want to talk a little bit about the hero's journey, because it's a template that we use for telling stories, because the hero finds self-agency and self-efficacy. And this is what we need. The hero surmounts obstacles. The hero tolerates adversity and passes through the dark nights of the soul. And stories teach us how the hero does this. Stories teach us plots that we can use to surmount obstacles. And stories teach us to persevere. And if one thing doesn't work, try something else and persist. Keep trying until you succeed. And this is what so many of our clients need to learn. And you know some heroes' journeys. You know Luke Skywalker, and you know his battles against the Empire. You know Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. You know Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings. You know Jane Eyre, who escaped her miserable home and went off to change her life. And of course, you know Harry Potter and his heroic journeys against Voldemort. So we use the 6-part story in working with people to change their story. And so what are the elements? A main character and a setting, an obstacle or a task facing the main character, a goal, and then an obstacle that's in the way of the goal, helpers, characters who hinder the progress toward the goal, a turning point, and what happens when the goal is achieved. And so these stories, helping people to tell these stories, and often about characters similar to themselves, and sometimes even animals representing themselves indirectly, can be really important. So, what is the moral of my story that I've been telling you? Is that tell people stories that inspire them to believe that they can get better, get well, function better. Tell people stories that show them how to persevere, how to persist, how to try again when their first strategy didn't succeed, how to persevere. Tell people stories that you believe. If you don't believe the story, it's not going to fly. Tell people stories that you're fully committed to as the truth. And listen. Jacques Lacan said, the greatest gift we can give someone is to listen without judgment or interpretation. And when we listen in that way, we gain the information that we need to tailor a story to meet the needs of the person whom we're with. And so giving nutraceuticals, doing acupuncture, doing osteopathy, all of that is wonderful. And it's so much more effective if you do it with a good story. And so That's what I want to leave you with today. So I thank you for listening.